Welcome back to Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership podcast. I'm so delighted to have this lovely young entrepreneur all the way from Nigeria who's moved to Canada. We are going to have an impactful conversation. So, Amarachi Kejeh, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to have you. I'm still pinching myself that we're on season 5, but here we are. So you have a beautiful bio, and we changed things up last year. And I would just love for you to give our listenership, which we are proud to tell you is in 65 countries, a high-level overview of who you are and what you do.
Awesome. So my name's Amarachi. I'm a strategy consultant that serves the nonprofit sector. In particular, I run a DIY strategic plan program, which is a do-it-yourself program that helps nonprofits develop their plans in-house, upscale their teams, think about practical implementation, and save up to 90% of consulting fees. I've been in entrepreneurship for about 5 years now, four-ish years, getting on 5. This is my 3rd business, so it's been an exciting adventure. And as you said, I'm originally from Nigeria. I currently live in a small town in Canada, but in between that, I have lived in the US. I've also lived in Australia. So had an exciting career even before getting into nonprofit consulting.
And I had the pleasure of meeting you at a women's leadership conference, and you moderated a panel. And I was just so impressed in how you carried yourself and just the energy and vibrancy that you brought to that panel. And just like I do, I reached out and connected, and we had a great conversation. And I think your story and your leadership and just your traveling around the globe is going to be so impactful for young leaders. So I'm going to jump into my first leadership question. So you are a young entrepreneur. Share with us some of the leadership lessons that you've learned along the way. Maybe you could share 1 or 2 with our listeners.
Sure. So before I started my business, my first leadership opportunity or official leadership opportunity was when I was a finance manager. So prior to even getting into nonprofit consulting, when I started in Vancouver and then ended up being transferred by my company to Dallas as a finance manager. And one of the first things I learned is that the fact that you have a title doesn't mean you're a great leader. Mm-hmm. So this is me at 23, turning 24. I was fortunate that I'd entered the company in a period where there was a lot of fluff. And so with lots of people leaving, it also provided lots of opportunities for an analyst like me to become a senior analyst and to get exposure. It was a helicopter company that had over 2,400 employees at that time. And so that early exposure really helped me to stand out. Now, fortunately, I stood out from a technical competency part, but from a leadership perspective, not quite. And so I struggled quite a bit with imposter syndrome. Like I'm sitting in the room and people on my team almost double my age, right? I'm learning how to balance the dynamics, right? I'm learning how to influence people. So that was my first learning, right? Because you're smart, because you got promoted, because you got the fancy title, doesn't mean that you're a leader. Doesn't mean that you're a good leader. You're a leader by title, but it doesn't mean you're a good leader. And one of the things that I did was to start investing in learning in my professional development. And so I joined a leaning circle in Dallas. It was a women's development circle for first-time managers. I also decided at that point, a year and a bit after my time as a finance manager, I was going to go back to school. I was going to get an MBA because I needed that big picture thinking. So that would be the first learning, right? Because you're smart, because you have a title, doesn't mean you're a good leader. The second one, and this I've learned from being an entrepreneur, it's important to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. And this brings me to some of the quotes you might hear when you're on a plane, and they say, make sure you put your mask on before you help anyone around you, right? And so that same idea, if you're burning out, if you're working a lot of hours, if you're not compensating yourself well, if you're enabling behaviors from your team and sort of compromising yourself, you're not going to have a sustainable business. You're not going to have an enjoyable journey as a leader, and you're going to burn out. And that's been my journey to some extent, starting businesses in my 20s, and now I'm in early 30s. I'm a lot wiser, and I try not to make those mistakes.
Well, and I mean, lessons learned are always a level of success to add to your toolkit. And I love that yours comes with a lot of laughter, and we have to laugh at imperfection, which is
Yeah.
why I named this podcast that. So welcome to the land of imperfection.
Thank you.
Okay, my second question has permanent residency on the show. What imperfections do you feel you bring to your heart-centered leadership?
Mm. That's a great question. There are two that come to mind. One is by nature or by nurture, I'm a fan of adventure. I get a bit restless. I look for new projects, exciting improvements. I get bored easily doing like same old, same old. I'm not a fan of status quo. So on one hand, it's great, right? And often our greatest strengths can be our greatest weaknesses as well. On the other hand, when it comes to leading people and having people work with you, sometimes it felt like drinking from a fire hose working with me, right? And so I've had to learn as well to calm down, understand the levels that people are in. It's also important hiring the right kinds of people that would love that kind of adventure, but also giving them space to get up to speed. So that's one of my imperfections. I love adventure, but yeah, it could be drinking from fire hose. The
Yeah,
second
great
one,
analogy.
the
That
second
fire hose can be uncontrollable sometimes.
oh man, the second one will be about my personality. So by default, I'm an introvert. I can put on an extroverted self, like you met at the conference. I can go to networking events, but I need to be able to refill. I need to be able to have downtime. And the first two businesses that I ran were consulting businesses. And the nature of it is you go hunt for projects, you get a project, you work with your team, and you deliver results for the client. And with strategic planning and facilitation projects, there's a lot of engagement, there's a lot of face time. And so what I found is I'll go through the sprints of projects where you're meeting with clients, you're meeting with team members, you're doing sales, you're doing all those things, and I would get overwhelmed because I'm not giving myself the time to recover. I'm on go, 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 go for 3 months, and then I'm freaking out, right? And so I think my imperfection, again, like the introverted self is wonderful for reflection, for thinking strategically, for leading with empathy and things like that. But at the same time, I need to be able to, the nature of my businesses, I've required that I'm proactive in taking care of myself. I'm proactive with centering wellness. I'm proactive with scheduling breaks. I'm proactive with having no meeting days. That way I don't burn out. And I don't burn out and I don't impact the team. Because when I'm not well, it's going to show up in how I lead my team, right?
Absolutely. I often talk about that life and leadership and interconnection, and beautiful way of what you just explained, how it happens to you and how to prevent it. Okay, my third question is, you have experienced leadership across the globe. You've been in Nigeria, you've come to Canada. Share with us some of the global contexts of learning versus challenges, etc., from different countries.
Yes, that's an interesting question because ultimately leadership is around leading people. If you're not leading people, you're not a leader. You can have a thousand AI chatbots that you're programming, that doesn't make you a leader, right? And so when you think about leadership in different contexts, first of all, it's recognizing your context. I was brought up in Nigeria. I lived there for 17 years. I moved to Canada for university. For a lot of my formative years and character molding has occurred in Nigeria. And so the way I show up is as a Nigerian that has picked up a couple of things from all over the world. So that's one important context to recognize. The other is the context of the people that I'm trying to lead. And again, because we live in a multicultural world, like you can be in Canada and live in a team and someone from Korea and China and Russia and wherever, and the way they show up, it's not a typical Canadian way because they come with that history and context, right? But it's important to understand the culture. And so the reason why I'm framing this is because I've run a business, or I've got a consulting business passively running in Nigeria. I've also done the same here in Canada, and it's a slightly different world. When you think of the Nigerian, even just going back to home upbringing, or how schools are run, or your experience in a church or a mosque, it tends to be very dictatorial. That's the default for leadership. And so what happens is when you bring a team of Nigerians, and I'm a Nigerian, but with the Canadian vibe or Canadian American, Australian, whatever you want to call it, I tend to be more egalitarian in my approach, and I want to hear from you. And sometimes it's a bit odd and awkward, or it takes a while to get people comfortable and sort of dig into the shells, and me asking open-ended questions instead of telling you, go do this, go do that, right? And so it takes the onboarding time. It takes a different, it's almost like a rewiring of mindset when working with me, because I come with a different approach. The other thing with that dictatorial mindset in Nigeria is there's a sense of deference to respect. Nigerians are very, so for example, I would call you Deb. Hi, Deb. In Nigeria, I would have to call you Mrs. Deb or Lady Deb or whatever title. If you've got a PhD, Dr. Deb, there's that sense of you've got to attribute or show respect from the get-go and even in the little things. Even in things like eye contact. I could go out for dinner with you here and I'm looking at you, eye contact, we're sitting pretty close and we're laughing. In Nigeria, there'll be a bit more space between both of us. I would look at your eyes and then I'll look away and then I'll look down. And it also depends on the tribe as well. My mom's comes from a tribe called the Yorubas, and they are they respect very tangible. So what hand do I use to shake you? How do I kneel down to greet you or bend down a bit? And so when you're working with a team again in Nigeria, it's sort of being aware of that. Like at 27, don't call me Mrs. Amarachi. I don't want to hear that. Like just call me Amarachi, or people older than me, like feeling like, oh, because I'm the boss, right? And so the molding stage of a team, like me working with a team in Nigeria has been very, 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 very important. Just trying to take people away from the natural Nigerian way of running things and deference to me compared to Canada. Now, what's interesting in Canada, and I think going back to, I'll talk about Nigeria and I talk about Canada. In Nigeria, we can be quite direct with communication. It's not about, we're not so good with quoting our words. It's like, you say it how it is, and that's considered good because I'm telling you the truth. I care about you and I'm going to tell you the truth. It might sting, but it's the truth, and the truth sometimes stings. Now in Canada, it's about sugarcoating it. It's about putting, even in medications, right? Like you see the same painkillers in Nigeria, it's like bland. Like you go for it and you taste it on your tongue. You get the painkillers in Canada and it's coated in whatever, like sugary, whatever substance, so that it's palatable. You can swallow it and you can digest it, right? And it's quite similar in the communication here. Canadians in particular like to be very polite. Sometimes can be aversive conflict. The yes might not really be a yes, but you're not quite sure. And so you got to take your time to figure out what that really means. And so it makes it quite interesting when you're running two teams simultaneously. Like in Nigeria, you understand if somebody says this isn't working, I get it, it's not working. In Canada, you have to really talk and say, but what are you really saying? And like put in scenarios, is that what you really mean? Right. And so in a way, I feel like sometimes I put on different personalities when bouncing across both worlds. But it's been an amazing learning journey for me as well, and a lot of self-awareness. Like for me, by default, I have the Nigerian frankness, and I've had to learn how to make it palatable when talking to a Canadian or an American team compared to Nigeria. Like Nigeria, I can just be like straightforward and like, yep, that's good, thank you, and they move on.
I love it. I love the laughter and the gregariousness that you have for all the different, leadership contexts that you have across the globe. Okay, for my last leadership question, share with us how you've been able to pivot or navigate leadership when you face failure. And I'd love to hear from both a perspective of your own self-leadership as well as leading a team.
Wonderful. So when I introduced myself, I said I've started 3 businesses. Right now, I've got 2 businesses because I exited one. And it was a beautiful consulting firm with a friend here in Canada. We were serving nonprofits as well, strategic planning primarily, and other facilitation and training gigs. But what I realized along the way was that the model wasn't going to be compatible with my lifestyle. And so what had happened was I moved to a small town, St. Thomas, Ontario, where we met. And I was craving a different lifestyle. I didn't want to do as much traveling and adventuring from that perspective. Part of it was driven by the fact that I was newly married. And so my husband had come to join me. I wanted a slower pace. I wanted to build relationships with my community. And the model just wasn't compatible. And going back to it's important for me to take care of myself, for me to take care of others. And so I had a frank, open conversation with my business partner at that time, just sharing, it's not working. I can't really be an owner anymore. It makes more sense for me to be more of a contractor behind the scenes, and sort of going through that navigation. And in terms of what my learnings have been, or what self-leadership, first of all, is just self-awareness. If I had continued, I would have burnt out. I was already going on. It's like being in a car where you're driving and you can see from the meter that you're already towards like low tank, like your fuel. It makes more sense to park, to find the nearest filling station, to fill up and to continue your journey. If I didn't, my car would stop on the road, right? And I have to call someone to tow me. It would have been a total breakdown. It would have been a mess for me, for my business partner, and for the team. And so part of it was just self-awareness. Amarachi, what's going on in your world right now? What makes sense? What is the right direction? And I decided that I needed a sabbatical. I didn't quite know where I was going, but I knew that where I had been was not the right path forward. I often tell people that was my quarter life crisis because I turned 30 last year. Not quite old enough to be a midlife crisis, so I'll take quarter life. But that self-leadership, it first starts with that self-awareness. And in terms of working with the team and having that frank conversation, and thankfully we had open conversations about the future. And I told her from the beginning, I don't think I'm going to be here forever. I think my job is to come and to help you establish, but I don't think I'm going to be hands-on. So that really made it easy to come to the conversation of, I think the time to wind down is now. Also with that was providing a good enough buffer. We were in the midst of a client project. You can't just wake up and walk off. Like, it's disruptive to everyone. And so making sure that we finished the project on a good note, hand it over to the client, transparent about what's going on, transparent with the team. I ended up giving about I think it was a 3-month runway, also to go through the legal, accounting, the what do you call this, cross training and transitioning over of the key aspects, right? And so I would say it first starts with self-awareness, and then the relationship with the founder and navigating that with the team in a way that makes sense. That was my journey with failure. It's been quite interesting because this time last year, I didn't quite know what I was going to do. But again, I knew I needed to pause. And so I took the pause. I attended events. I volunteered in the community. I had a lot of downtime. I read a lot of books. And eventually, step by step, the clarity came for me to develop a DIY to take time program, a program that I can serve a lot more local non-for-profits that don't have the budget, a program that doesn't require as much traveling, a program that doesn't require as much client time and as much facilitation. And so it's allowed me to transition into a model that is sustainable, that I can take care of myself. And I know that whoever comes on board with me will be taken care of because the model that works.
Absolutely. And what insight and clarity you've developed during that process. And I think it's you're such a good role model for other young entrepreneurs. And sometimes we have to hit the pause button. And I love the quarter life wisdom. I like that. Okay, I'm going to switch to my Fab Four. What's one practical tip you'd like to give our listeners today for embracing heart-centered leadership into their daily lives?
I'm going to go back to taking care of yourself. If I look back to the first years of entrepreneurship, and I think sometimes, especially as a young entrepreneur, and you see some of the ads on YouTube, there's this sort of hustle culture, the hustle bros. We wake up in the morning, we do the ice bath, we exercise, and we go for all those meetings, and it's almost like there's a desire to sprint instead of take things as a marathon, right? Anything that lasts long needs to be enduring. It needs to have deep foundation. And you can't do that when you're continuously sprinting, right? And so, especially if they're younger entrepreneurs, whatever that means, looking at things as a marathon and not as a sprint. And with that as well, faith to forgive yourself. I'm young. I don't have the wisdom that you have. Like, I can read your book and I'm grateful for your book and I've picked a few nuggets, but it's nowhere near the level in which it's ingrained in you because you've gone through that journey. And so in looking at things as a marathon as well, I'm embracing space I'm going to uncover myself. I'm going to uncover that, I've got this bad character. I've got those things that I picked up from a Nigerian context that is not quite the best way to treat people, not the best way to communicate with people. Learning to forgive myself, right? I've made mistakes. Sometimes I feel like I've wasted time, I've forgone money. But looking at things like a marathon, I know where I'm headed and I recognize that good things takes time. It's like an analogy. I love using analogies. As you can figure, I tell people, are you trying to grow corn like maize, or are you trying to grow a cashew tree? Because it's a completely different cycle. The amount of time you're going to wait maybe 5 years before you can get any reasonable fruit from the cashew tree. But once it's there, it's there. The maintenance is nowhere as much as corn that you got to keep digging and planting every 3 months, 6 months, whatever that cycle is. And so that would be my advice. Yeah.
I love that analogy. I always say to my clients, the day you plant the seed is not the day you eat the fruit, which is basically what you're saying. I love it. Okay, if your leadership style had a theme song, what would it be?
Oh, I think that comes to mind, but it feels more like an entrepreneurial song than leadership. I'm gonna go with it. It's Destiny's Child, I'm a Survivor. I'm a survivor.
I love it.
I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna stop. I'm gonna work harder. I'm gonna work harder with myself. I'm a survivor. I make mistakes. I'm gonna pick myself up. I'm not gonna keep staying down. If I make mistakes with my team, I'm gonna apologize and be like, guys, I'm sorry.
And you're my first guest that broke out into song. Good for you.
Ooh,
Look
I
at
love
that. Okay, here's my third question. If you could summarize a key takeaway or lesson from our discussion today, what would you share with our listeners?
Continuous progress. Continuous progress. You're not perfect. I mean, I love the title imperfect. You're imperfect, right? And so it's that continuous progress. Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, you are just delightful. I knew this was going to be a fun conversation. So I'm going to have you finish the show by finishing this sentence for me. And I wish you continued success, and I look forward to our upcoming lunch. Finish this for me. Heart-centered leadership is
taking care of others and yourself. It's got to be both.